My name is David O'Driscoll. All I know is journalism. Ever since I created my own school newspaper at the age of 12, all I've wanted to do is to find out about all of the interesting things in life and tell people about them. Some people have a particular disdain for individuals in my line of work, and I can't say I blame them. Most of my colleagues only care about shock value and clickbait. They'll do anything and say anything to create a good story. It's no wonder that journalism is a dying art. And it is an art. It's about shining a light on the humanity in a story, or uncovering the truth for all to see, not to make a quick buck. I've done a lot in my career so far to make myself proud. I've reunited distraught mothers and fathers with their long-lost children. I've uncovered corruption in local officials, and numerous other stories. I feel proud to do this job. I'm not sure I can say the same for many of the others I work with. However, as my bank balance would show, these kind of stories just don't sell newspapers or drive traffic to our website in this new world. These days, the most popular stories and articles thrive on speculation and gossip. As the old saying goes, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Unfortunately, there's not much room in this industry for someone like me anymore. Print media is a dying industry, and it's all about driving as much traffic as possible through sensationalist or shocking stories. When I spoke to my editor a few days ago, he let me know he was going to have to let some of us go soon. The paper wasn't making as much money, and he had to trim the fat, as he so delicately put it. He said that when it came to him making the decision, he had to go with the staff members who are generating the most traffic and interest. He didn't outright tell me, but I knew that I was towards the bottom of that list as it stood. I've just got a mortgage with my wife. It really isn't a good time for me to lose my job right about now. Times are tight as it is, and losing my position at the paper would be the final nail in the coffin. Luckily we don't have any kids at the moment, but we were planning to try soon. Looks like that idea's out the window while I have this hanging over me. I haven't told my wife yet about the troubles at work. She's a nurse. She has enough stress in her life at the moment as it is. As I woke up in bed this morning, with the first ray of light pouring through the curtains, I looked over at the other side of the bed. Empty. My wife was on the night shift at the moment, and we weren't seeing too much of each other. I'd be gone by the time she got back from work, and the only quality time we had together when she was on night shift was for a few hours in the evening. We'd grab a bite to eat and watch a show or two together, but then it'd be time for me to go to bed and her to go to work. I won't lie, it was tough. But she loved her job, just as much as I love mine. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for the cobwebs of sleep to blow away like usual. It seemed to be a more common theme lately, but my mind kept revisiting the conversation I had with my boss a week or so ago. I had to find a good story. I had to. But one thing I wasn't willing to do was compromise my morals. It had to be a real story, but fascinating enough to pique the interest of the public. All the way from getting up, grabbing a cup of coffee, stepping in the shower and getting in the car, I was racking my brain for ideas. For any seasoned drivers, we all know that bizarre autopilot which takes hold when you're going through your regular commute. Quite often, I'll arrive at the office after 30 minutes of driving, with absolutely no memory of how I got there. Your body just kind of automatically performs the movements, and your brain wanders off for you to get lost in thought. It's amazing how that happens. As I was 10 minutes into the drive, something broke through the autonomy. I like to stay connected to local happenings, which makes complete sense considering my line of work. I like to know what's going on in my local area. It's nice to feel part of a community. As I was taking the same turn that I take every day, the presenter was running through the "and in other news" segment that adds some variety and levity at the end of the news. Normally, it's inconsequential things such as Mrs. Jones found her missing cat up a tree 2 miles away, or little Bobby found a coin in the yard that's worth thousands of dollars. Things that pique your interest but don't have any real depth. But this story managed to capture my attention in full. "And another news today," the radio presenter said with their buttery smooth voice. "If you're still looking for a holiday destination this summer, why not a lighthouse? Only this lighthouse has a checkered past. The Surway Isle Lighthouse has been in disrepair for the past decade or two since closing. It was the scene of an unexplained disappearance for 3 lighthouse keepers in the early 1900s, presumed to have perished in a heavy storm. Since then, it's been bought and renovated into a summer home for rent. So if you'd like to stay for a week or two at a place with history and character, in solitude from your normal hectic life, why not give this a try? The lighthouse has been available for weekend and weekly stays since the start of the year. Unexplained disappearance is the phrase that caught my attention. This had all the markings of a great story. It had intrigue, mystery, and also a unique setting. It wasn't every day that you heard about a lighthouse, especially one in such a remote location. Although I wanted to do a bit of research beforehand on the background, I decided there and then that I had to try and stay there. It seemed like it had almost been fate for me to hear that news story, as if I was being given one last chance to save my career. And if it didn't lead anywhere, at least I would have had a vacation for once. It had been years since my last. For the last 15 minutes of my journey, everything else faded away into nothing. All of my previous thoughts and worries about my job and my future. My mind always wandered back to the lighthouse. What happened to the 3 lighthouse keepers? Was there anything nefarious involved, or was it just an unfortunate accident? Is there any evidence left to suggest what happened to them? These questions were swirling around my head constantly. It almost became an obsession. This could be the perfect story I'd been waiting for. As I arrived at the office building, I was almost in a trance. I could think of nothing else. I even forgot my coffee in the cup holder of my car. I tapped my pass onto the card reader by the front door, nodded a greeting to the security guard, and climbed the single floor of stairs that led to my office. Luckily, there were hardly any of my colleagues in today. No doubt the pessimistic announcement from my boss had sent similar shock waves through them as it did me. I'm sure they were also out and about, looking for the perfect story that would save their jobs. I sat down at my desk and logged in. As always, one of my favourite ever pictures greeted me as a wallpaper. My wife and I on our wedding day. I didn't want to let her down. I had to make this work. With a brief respite to reflect, I opened my web browser and got to work. Surway Isle Lighthouse was the first search term I tried, but I was only greeted with geographic entries and the news story that was broadcast earlier. According to an online encyclopedia, the lighthouse was located on a remote island 20 miles off the coast. The closest coastal town was 80 miles away from me, so I faced a 100-mile trip. Not too bad on the face of things. I noticed a few other key facts. It was constructed in 1903 and apparently had a rudimentary set of railway tracks which were originally intended to provide provisions for the crew and fuel for the light in a tower. As I scrolled down further, I found an entry called 1908 Crew Disappearance. This would hopefully tell me everything I needed to know. Apparently, the lighthouse had been manned by 3 men, James Russell, Thomas Blake, and William Callahan. There was an abnormally fierce storm one night, and a passing passenger ship noted in the ship's log that the light wasn't operational. It had to dock at a nearby town to continue its journey once the storm had passed. Once the storm had cleared a few days later, a rescue boat was launched to Surway Isle to investigate the cause. Upon disembarking the vessel, it was found that the entrance gate to the main compound and the main door were both closed. In addition, the beds were unmade, the clock on the kitchen wall had stopped, the table was set for a meal that had never been eaten, and there were several chairs toppled over. After a lengthy investigation by the rescue crew, no sign was found of the missing lighthouse keepers. A later investigation by the police also drew no leads. Their disappearance was eventually ruled as accidental deaths due to being blown over the cliffs or drowning, despite no bodies being found. The lighthouse was closed for a year or two while investigations were carried out, but once they'd ended, a new crew was installed, and that was that. There weren't any other strange occurrences until the lighthouse was closed in 1989. It lay in disrepair until last year, when a local developer bought the site and renovated it. With that, I'd reached the end of the article. I clicked back to the search and selected the site for the news story. Scanning down the page, luckily they'd included a link to book a stay there. As the page opened, I must admit they'd done a great job with the renovation. There were numerous pictures showing the lighthouse inside and out. Each room seemed to have a perfect blend of modern comfort and preserved history. It was exactly the kind of place that could inspire a captivating piece, not just about its past, but about the experience of staying in such a place. I clicked on the booking link, and to my surprise, there was a vacancy for the upcoming weekend. I hurriedly entered my details and reserved a 3-night stay. The anticipation and excitement began to build, overshadowing my previous worries. This was it, my chance to find a story that could not only save my job, but reignite my passion for journalism. The next few days passed in a blur. I packed my bags with essentials, including my trusted voice recorder, camera, and notepad. I didn't tell my wife about the specifics, just that I needed to go on a work trip that could potentially secure my position at the paper. She gave me a reassuring smile, wished me luck, and told me to stay safe. On Friday morning, I loaded my car and set off towards the coast. The drive was serene, the countryside rolling by in lush greens and blues, a stark contrast to the urban monotony of my daily commute. The further I drove, the more isolated it became. By the time I reached the small coastal town where the ferry to Surway Isle was docked, it felt as though I'd stepped back in time. I boarded the ferry, a small vessel that looked like it had seen better days. The captain, a grizzled old man named Joe, seemed amused when I told him I was headed to the lighthouse. "Not many folks go out there these days," he said, his voice rough and seasoned by the sea air. "You sure you know what you're getting into?" I smiled and nodded, though a small part of me wondered if I did. As the ferry pulled away from the dock, the town quickly receded into the distance, replaced by the endless expanse of the sea. The journey took about an hour, and as the island came into view, I felt a shiver of anticipation. The lighthouse stood tall and solitary on a cliff, its white and red stripes stark against the grey sky. Joe helped me to unload my bags and wished me good luck. "I'll be back on Monday to pick you up," he said. And with a final nod, he was gone, the ferry shrinking into the horizon. Standing alone on the dock, I looked up at the path leading to the lighthouse. The air was crisp and salty, and the only sound was the distant crashing of waves against the rocks. I hoisted my bags and began the walk up the narrow, winding trail. The closer I got, the more imposing the lighthouse appeared. It was beautifully restored, but its history seemed to linger in the air, heavy and almost palpable. I reached the main door, retrieved the key from the lockbox as instructed, and stepped inside. The interior was just as charming as the photos suggested. The walls were adorned with vintage maritime decor, and the furniture was a blend of antique and modern comforts. I spent the first hour exploring the rooms, getting a feel for the place. The kitchen was well stocked, the living room cosy, and the bedroom offered a breathtaking view of the ocean. I spent the rest of the time with the rapidly fading light, taking notes and photographs, capturing every detail. As evening approached, I made myself a simple dinner and settled in the living room with my laptop. I began drafting the outline of my article, weaving together the facts I gathered with the ambience of the place. There was something about the isolation and the history that felt almost magical, and I wanted to convey that in my writing. I decided that I'd explore the rest of the island tomorrow, once morning had broken. As night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The lighthouse, which had seemed so welcoming in the daylight, now felt different somehow. The wind howled outside, and the old structure creaked and groaned. I tried to brush off the unease as just the natural sounds of an old building, but it was hard to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I must be imagining things. My imagination's running away with me, I muttered to myself. It's been a long, exhausting day. I must be tired. I therefore decided to call it a night and headed to the bedroom. As I lay in bed, I listened to the sounds of the night and the island. The wind, the waves, and an occasional distant forecall from a passing ship. I drifted off to sleep, but my rest was uneasy, filled with strange, fragmented dreams. I saw the faces of the 3 lighthouse keepers, their expressions a mix of fear and confusion. They were calling out, but their words were lost in the storm. I woke up abruptly, my heart pounding. The room was dark, and for a moment I wasn't sure where I was. As my eyes adjusted, I saw a faint light coming from under the door. I got up and opened it, stepping into the hallway. The light was coming from the lantern room at the top of the lighthouse. It shouldn't have been on. I hadn't turned it on. I felt a chill run down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously made my way up the spiral staircase. The light grew brighter as I approached, and when I reached the top, I saw the lantern was indeed lit, casting an eerie glow across the room. There was no one there. I stood in the doorway, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a timer or an automatic system I wasn't aware of. I took a deep breath and stepped into the room. As I approached the lantern, it flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. My light being cut through the gloom, but it did little to calm my nerves. I heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of the wind. I spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I backed out of the room and hurried down the stairs, my heart racing. My mind playing tricks, I breathed heavily. Back in the safety of the bedroom, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the result of stress and fatigue. I forced myself to lie down and eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and unsettled. Sticking with the plan I made yesterday, I still decided to spend the day exploring the island, hoping the fresh air and exercise would clear my head. I followed the old railway tracks that wound through the island, leading to various outbuildings and storage sheds. Most were empty, filled with nothing but dust and dirt. I found a small cemetery, tucked away in a secluded corner of the island. The headstones were weathered and covered in moss, but I could still make out the names: James Russell, Thomas Blake, and William Callahan, the 3 lighthouse keepers. Seeing their names etched in stone made their story feel more real, more tragic. Forever in our hearts and thoughts, the headstones read. Taken from us too soon, but they never forgot their duty. On a small plaque next to the headstones, there was a small obituary explaining the history behind their untimely deaths. There was an odd absence of noise in the cemetery. Although it was small, it seemed as though the sound of the crashing waves were muffled or subdued in some way by the area itself. Silently paying my respects, I then walked down the small dirt path leading out of the cemetery and looked in wonder. The majestic lighthouse was on the opposite side of the island, and it certainly looked striking against the now blue sky. If I wasn't eager to carry on my investigation, it'd be a perfect day for a nice picnic and some sunbathing. I'd already explored the lighthouse and the immediate surrounding vicinity, so I decided to take a rocky-looking path leading down the northerly side of the island, towards the bottom of the chalky cliffs. As I made my way further down the path, the way became more and more treacherous as I went. This clearly wasn't an often used route by tourists. Although I was making sure that my footing was sure and stable, my mind kept returning to thoughts of last night. Was it just my imagination? I was certain that the lantern at the top of the lighthouse was on, and it definitely sounded a lot like a whisper when the light disappeared. But sure enough, when I woke up, it was as if nothing had happened. There was definitely something off about this place, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I was both dreading and looking forward to tonight in equal measure. After admittedly much longer than I was expecting, I made my way to the bottom of the cliffs. The way down to the shore was blocked off by a series of jagged rocks. There was no way I was going to put my life in danger. It didn't look as though there was anything of interest in the distance anyway. As I looked to my right, though, I spotted an alcove, lined with rusted iron, presumably to stop the entrance collapsing. I peered my head inside. A short distance into the opening was a large weathered sign with bright red writing. It read, "Warning. Do not attempt to go any further. Cave prone to collapse." As my eyes began to adjust to the light, I could see the way ahead was completely blocked by boulders. It wasn't surprising. I imagined the opening would have been exposed to the waves in very severe storms. Although my curiosity was pricking at me to try clearing the rubble, self-preservation prevailed. I wouldn't be able to write the article if I was dead. So I decided to leave it be, and returned back up the rocky path towards the lighthouse. As the ground started to turn from red and brown to green, I looked towards the horizon. The azure blue from earlier had given way to a fierce red. The sun was beginning to disappear over the horizon. As I marvelled at the beautiful colours, I could see there were worryingly dark grey storm clouds gathering in a distance. I'd have to call today's exploration to a close. I didn't want to be the next victim, if it was in fact a storm that killed the 3 lighthouse keepers all those years ago. When I returned to the lighthouse, all in all, it was a very subdued evening. There was some light rain outside, but nothing world-ending. The soft pitter-patter against the window provided a relaxing backdrop for me to continue writing some of my article on the laptop, and eventually retire to the bedroom with a herbal tea to settle in with a good book. When you don't have internet or a TV to help you pass the time passes surprisingly slowly. I'd been reading for what felt like hours, but when I glanced at the clock on the wall, it only showed 9:30. It was an exhausting day full of walking and exertion, so when my eyelids began to droop, I took that as a sign to call it a night. I had one more day to uncover any mysteries, if in fact there were any. But I wasn't sure there was much else to explore on the island. It was only small. But I still had a splinter in my mind, nagging at me, but there was still something I'd missed. And so, I gave in to sleep. I awoke to a crescendo of noise and light. Although I was relatively insulated and protected in the bedroom, I could still see bright flashes of white light exploding from underneath the door. The sea was crashing loudly against the rocks, accompanied by the deep, guttural rumbling of a thunderstorm. Grabbing my phone as a flashlight in case I needed it, I gently pushed open the bedroom door. The display on my phone was reading 1:43 a.m. As each flash illuminated the living quarters below the tower, I could see that something was amiss. Gone were the modern comforts and fittings from the refurbishment. Instead, it felt like I'd gone back in time. The stylish dining table had now been replaced by a rustic, splintered construction, and the comfortable seats were now basic wooden chairs. An earthy scent filled my nostrils. As I shone my flashlight onto the table, I could see 3 bowls of stew sitting on the table, with loaves of bread and old-fashioned cutlery. My mouth hung open in astonishment. Is this a dream? I tried pinching myself, but nothing happened. This had to be real. I felt like I'd gone back in time 100 years. I rushed up the spiral staircase leading to the lantern room at the top. This time, unlike last night, the lantern wasn't on. But it was easy to find my way around due to the cacophony of light and sound all around me from the storm. Looking out of the windows surrounding the tower, all I could see was an explosion of frost, foam, and sea spray. Judging by the sound, the waves were battering the island with all of its might. My eyes began to be drawn, however, to 3 silhouettes standing at the top of the cliff, overlooking the ocean. My breath caught in my throat as I peered closer, trying to make out more details in the fleeting light provided by the storm's violent flashes. The figures stood motionless, their forms almost blending into the rugged landscape. They seemed to be looking directly at me, though I couldn't see their faces clearly. Although I couldn't make out their facial features, with each flash of light, I could see more details. Old-fashioned oilskin coats adorned their rugged bodies, and wiry beards hung heavily from their faces. I knew in my heart that these must be the ghosts of James Russell, Thomas Blake, and William Callahan, the doomed lighthouse keepers that disappeared all those years ago. Strangely, I didn't feel scared looking at them. They exuded a profound sadness, almost melancholic. I didn't want to head outside of the lighthouse due to the ferocity of the raging storm outside, but instead I continued watching in amazement from the tower. What do they want from me? Why are they here? I whispered to myself, my voice swallowed by the storm. The figures continued to stare up at me, motionless and silent. Then, almost in unison, they raised their arms and pointed down the cliffside. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if they were showing me the way. After a brief moment, they dropped their arms back down to their sides and began to march slowly along the cliff edge and down the path. The last I saw of them was their oilskin hats passing behind the cliff top and below. Although the pull of curiosity was almost irresistible, my brain overruled my heart. I'd be taking my life into my own hands if I was to traverse down that path in such a fierce storm. I didn't get a wink of sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed huddled at the top of the lighthouse, every minute wishing for the storm to pass and morning to break. After what seemed like an eternity, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The storm finally abated. Utterly exhausted, but driven by an insatiable curiosity, I decided to follow the path the ghosts had taken, without even having anything to eat. As I travelled back down the spiral staircase into the living quarters, everything was now back to the way it was. There was no food on the table now, nor any of the splintered furniture. In their place was the rustic yet modern fixtures and fittings from the refurbishment. I still had no idea whether last night was just a dream. I just had to find out, one way or the other. I donned a raincoat and made my way out of the lighthouse. There was still a light drizzle in the air, but the storm had definitely passed. I could see the sun start to break through the clouds in the distance. The island was eerily quiet, the only sound being the distant, calming rush of waves. My feet felt heavy on the damp ground as I carefully made my way down the cliffside path the haunting figures had pointed to. The storm had left the path muddy and treacherous. Each step required caution to avoid slipping on the wet rocks. Despite the difficulty, I felt a strange sense of purpose, as if the spirits of the lighthouse keepers were guiding my steps. As I gingerly approached the alcove again, I immediately spotted that there was something different. The sign and the boulders blocking the way had now disappeared into thin air, leaving a dark pathway into the bowels of the cave. I knew I was taking my life into my hands, but somehow I knew I'd be kept safe. I could sense the presence of the lighthouse keepers in the air, almost familiar, yet protective. Taking a deep breath, I ducked into the alcove once more. The air was damp and musty, the scent of sea salt mingling with earth. The pathway narrowed considerably, not far into the cave, eventually revealing a tight gap, just wide enough to squeeze through. The passage beyond was dark and cramped, but I pressed on, my curiosity outweighing my fear. After what felt like an eternity of crawling through the narrow tunnel, it finally opened up into a small chamber. The air was thick and stale, and the only sound was the faint drip of water from the ceiling. My flashlight swept across the room, revealing old wooden crates and rusted tools scattered about. There was also a collection of oil lanterns, long since rendered useless. But what caught my eye was the row of shelves on the far wall, lined with old, weathered logbooks. I approached the shelves in trepidation. The logbooks were covered in dust and cobwebs, but they were remarkably well preserved. I picked up the nearest one and carefully opened it, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The entries were written in a neat, flowing script. They chronicled the daily lives of the lighthouse keepers, detailing their routines, the weather, and the ships they saw passing by. As I flipped through the pages, I found the logbook belonging to James Russell. His entries were filled with observations about the sea, the weather, and the occasional personal note about his fellow keepers. Then, to my amazement, I found some entries for the fateful night of the storm in 1908. The logbook detailed the final days of the three keepers. They chronicled their growing fear as the storm approached, strange occurrences in the lighthouse, and finally, their plan to seek shelter in the cave during the worst of the storm. Russell's handwriting was frantic, the ink smeared in places as if written in haste. December 12th, 1908, it read. The storm is unlike anything we've seen before. The wind howls like a banshee, and the waves crash against the cliffs with terrifying force. Blake and Callaghan are trying to keep the lantern lit, but the wind keeps extinguishing it. We tried to send a distress signal, but the equipment failed. I fear for our lives. If we do not make it through this night, let it be known that we did our best to keep the light burning. God help us. The next entry was even more disturbing, written by Thomas Blake. Something is not right. I saw a figure outside in the storm, but when I called out, there was no answer. Russell is missing. Callaghan and I searched everywhere, but there's no sign of him. The storm is growing worse. We're trapped here, and I fear we may not survive the night. The final entry was penned by William Callaghan, and it frightened me to my core. Blake is gone, it read. One moment he was beside me, and the next he vanished into the storm. I'm alone now. The light has gone out, and I can hear voices calling to me from the darkness. They're not human. If anyone finds this, know that we did not abandon our post. There is something on this island, something ancient and malevolent. Pray, but it does not find you. My hands tremble as I close the logbook. The story was far more sinister than I'd ever imagined. The disappearances weren't just a tragic accident. There was something malevolent at work on this island. The spirits of the lighthouse keepers had tried to show me the truth, to warn me. I knew I had to get back to the mainland and share what I'd found. This story was more than just a mystery. It was a revelation. As I carefully made my way back through the tunnel and up the cliffside path, I felt a sense of urgency. The storm had passed, but the darkness that had claimed the lighthouse keepers was still out there. Back at the lighthouse, I packed my things quickly, pausing only to take a few final photographs and jot down some last notes. The ferry wasn't due until the next day, but I couldn't stay here any longer. I knew that I had one more night to stay here, but in my soul, I felt as though the entity mentioned by the lighthouse keepers would make an appearance tonight. Don't ask me how I knew, but I felt more than anything that if I stayed one more night, I'd meet the same fate as the doomed keepers. I made my way to the dock, hoping to flag down a passing boat or find some other way off the island. Luckily, I managed to flag down a passing fishing boat and make my way to the mainland. I sat in a hushed and reflective silence as we traversed the water. I think I was still in shock from the events of the past few days. I drove home like a madman. Although my stomach was growling at me in hunger, I had to finish my article while it was fresh in my mind. But almost more importantly than that, I had to make sure that no one else could be a victim to the entity or being that the lighthouse keepers spoke about. When I finally arrived back home, I wrote furiously, pouring everything I had into the story. I recounted the history of the lighthouse, the tragic disappearances, and the chilling entries in the logbooks. I included my own experiences, the eerie events of the nights I spent there, and the ghosts that had guided me to the truth. I knew that this would be viewed with skepticism, but it was the truth. It's always been about the truth. I worked into the night. I was determined that I had to tell their story. By hell or high water, this would be the best article I'd ever written. Back at the newspaper office the following morning, my editor was stunned by the depth and detail of my story. It was published as a special feature, and the response was overwhelming. The public was captivated by the mystery of the Surway Isle Lighthouse, and I was hailed for my investigation skills. There were still many comments expressing disbelief, but I knew this was real. Whether they believed me or not was up to them. To ensure that their fate remained undisturbed, and to ensure that no one else was put in danger, I informed the authorities of my findings, and that the location was unsafe for anyone to stay at. Of course, though, my pleas focused on the unsafe cave and jagged rocks on the shore, rather than the entity mentioned in the lighthouse keeper's logs. Despite my pleas to the contrary, they insisted they perform an investigation of the island to corroborate my story. Thankfully, their investigation was completed without incident. Strangely, though, having investigated the cave, they couldn't find any indication of the ancient logbooks that I mentioned to them. According to them, the path was blocked off by immovable boulders. However, to my relief, they condemned the area due to endangerment to human life. They ruled that the cave was prone to further collapse at any moment, and that the cliffs were unstable. All ferries and vessels were forbidden from travelling to the island from that point onwards. Much to the annoyance of the property developer, the lighthouse was also condemned and ruled as unsafe. It was therefore ruled as derelict. I'm sure the developer was given a tidy sum from their insurance, but they were no doubt cursing my name. But I didn't care. The important thing was that no one else would be put in danger. I also thanked my lucky stars that I managed to escape with my life, and I didn't meet the same fate as the lighthouse keepers. Despite the closure of the lighthouse, the story of Surway Isle continued to captivate the public's imagination. My article sparked a renewed interest in the island's history, and people from all over began to speculate about the mysteries that lay hidden within its shores. And so I started work with a brand new vigour. I couldn't wait to uncover the next great story. But almost more importantly than that, I was pleased to have honoured the memory of James, Thomas and William. Something had happened to them that fateful day. It wasn't an accident. But beyond all of that, I still had something nagging away in my mind. I still felt that I hadn't discovered the true secret of the island, the malevolent and ancient entity mentioned by the lighthouse keepers. As I sat there, watching the number of views and comments on my story increase by the minute, I knew deep down that I would return to the mysterious island one day to finish what I'd started.